The morning after our wedding, the house was a quiet chaos of suitcases, half-open drawers, and neatly stacked honeymoon essentials, the kind of controlled mess that usually made me laugh, except today I couldn't shake a strange feeling of unease. My husband, Jason, was humming a song I didn't recognize as he folded shirts, occasionally tossing them into the suitcase with practiced precision, and I forced myself to smile at him, the memory of our vows still fresh in my mind, warm but fragile, like sunlight through a cracked window. I had never seen him so at ease, and maybe that was why I noticed the small details that felt off, like the way his hand lingered over the hotel brochures longer than necessary, or the subtle twitch in his jaw every time the phone rang, even though it hadn't yet. I brushed it off as pre-honeymoon nerves, telling myself these were just the ordinary jitters everyone spoke of, but deep down a shadow of suspicion had already crept into the corners of my mind, one I couldn't quite name, one I couldn't quite ignore. And then the phone rang, its shrill tones slicing through the quiet, making both of us pause mid-motion. I answered it, expecting some trivial vendor confirmation or a last-minute honeymoon booking, but instead it was a voice I didn't know, professional yet urgent, a voice that seemed to press against my chest as it spoke. "Hello? This is the registry office. We reviewed your paperwork again," the woman said, and I felt my stomach drop even before I processed the next words. "You should come in person, alone, and do not tell your husband anything." I blinked, the phone trembling slightly in my hand, unsure if I had misheard, because why would a government office request secrecy from your spouse, especially the day after the wedding, when nothing had even had the chance to go wrong? The woman's tone left no room for argument, no opportunity to clarify, only the cold edge of authority and the implication that something was very, very wrong. I hung up before she could add anything else, my mind racing in circles, heart hammering as Jason, oblivious to the conversation, started folding another shirt, whistling, completely unaware of the weight of the world that had just dropped into my lap. I couldn't tell him, not yet, not until I understood what was happening, but the guilt of hiding something from him, even something so mysterious, gnawed at me. My fingers shook as I picked up the wedding photo we had taken yesterday, the bright smiles frozen in paper, a perfect memory that suddenly felt fragile, unreal. The thought of leaving him behind, even for a short while, made me queasy, but the registry's insistence was clear, urgent, undeniable. I tried to calm myself, reasoning through every possible scenario, perhaps a clerical error, maybe a missing signature, a minor technicality, something mundane blown out of proportion, but there was that single word echoing in my mind, repeated with every heartbeat: alone. I needed to go alone, and the unspoken command not to tell Jason made my mind spiral into darker possibilities. I spent minutes pacing the room, staring at the neatly packed bags and our honeymoon tickets, imagining the registrar's office waiting for me with some official letter, or perhaps a question that would unravel everything we had just promised to each other. Could there be a legal mistake? An old marriage claim I had never known about? Something from my family's past that had been buried but not erased? I thought about my parents, their cautious smiles, the secrets they always hinted at but never admitted, the quiet tensions that always lingered beneath the surface, the hushed phone calls, and the times my father's gaze seemed to follow me like a warning rather than love. I tried to shake it off, told myself to breathe, but the voice on the phone replayed itself endlessly in my head. "Come alone, do not tell your husband." And I realized in a sickening moment of clarity that whatever awaited me at the registry office wasn't just paperwork. It was personal, and it was dangerous, and it came from somewhere deep within the folds of my past, somewhere I had never wanted to confront, not on my wedding day, not ever. I considered calling a friend, anyone I could trust, but the office's instructions had been so precise, so insistent, that even the thought of breaking them made my stomach twist. Alone, not a word to Jason. I could almost hear his laughter echoing down the hallway, his careless confidence filling the room, and I felt a pang of desperation. Could I protect him by hiding the truth? Could I face whatever this was without dragging him into it? I packed a small bag with essentials, wallet, ID, a notebook, a pen, as if somehow that would prepare me for the unknown that awaited me, but nothing could ready me for the storm that was coming. Every step I took toward the car was heavy with hesitation, my heart a drum of warning, every shadow in the quiet streets outside seeming to twist and flicker with hidden meaning, every passerby a potential witness to the unraveling of a life I had just begun to live. I drove in silence, windows up, the engine's hum the only sound I could bear, replaying the registry office's words in my mind like a mantra. Alone, alone. Do not tell your husband. And I rehearsed what I would say, what I would ask, but the more I thought, the more impossible it became to imagine the meeting ending well. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles white, the sunlight glinting harshly against the dashboard, blinding me for a moment, and in that instant I realized something I had always known but never named. My life was about to change forever, and there would be no turning back once the registry doors closed behind me. And yet, despite the fear, a part of me moved forward, compelled by curiosity, by a strange mix of duty and dread, because some truths demand to be faced, no matter the cost. I parked outside the nondescript building, heart hammering, and as I took my first step toward the entrance, I felt the weight of 1,000 untold stories pressing against my chest, the weight of my own history, my family's secrets, and the unknown consequences of whatever awaited me inside. One deep breath, one push of the door, and I was stepping into a reality I had never imagined, where every choice, every lie, and every hidden truth was about to collide in a way that would leave nothing untouched. I stepped through the registry office door, the cool, sterile air immediately hitting me like a wall, and my footsteps echoed across the polished floor in a way that made the space feel larger, emptier, and somehow more intimidating than it had any right to be. A receptionist looked up from her desk, eyes polite but distant, and gestured toward the waiting area, where I noticed a single chair set deliberately apart from the others, as if designed for someone like me, someone who had been summoned for reasons unknown but clearly serious. I hesitated at the threshold, my mind spinning with scenarios, from the mundane to the terrifying, and then I walked slowly toward the chair, the weight of secrecy pressing down on my shoulders. The ticking of a clock seemed unnaturally loud, each second stretching like elastic, and I caught myself imagining Jason back at our apartment, arranging our honeymoon suitcase, completely unaware that his new wife might be standing on the brink of disaster, and the thought both terrified and enraged me. After what felt like an eternity, a door at the far end of the room opened, and a woman stepped out, mid-40s, smartly dressed, with an expression that mixed authority and something I couldn't quite name, perhaps pity, perhaps calculation. She gestured for me to follow, and I obeyed, my shoes clicking sharply against the floor, every echo a drumbeat counting down to whatever truth awaited me. We walked down a narrow hallway, the walls close, the air thick with the faint scent of paper and disinfectant, and she spoke finally, in a voice low and controlled. "Sit. We need to discuss your marriage documents." I sat, knees tight together, hands clenched in my lap, trying to summon some semblance of composure, but my chest felt tight, my throat dry, and the words I wanted to say seemed to vanish as quickly as they formed. She placed a manila folder on the table, sliding it toward me with deliberate care, and I reached out slowly, hesitating before I opened it, as if the act itself might unleash something I couldn't contain. Inside, I found copies of documents I had signed, certificates I thought were final, but there were annotations, stamps, and corrections I had never seen, and a handwritten note that made my stomach turn cold. Immediate attention required, verification incomplete, previous marriage unresolved. My mind froze, thoughts colliding in confusion. Previous marriage unresolved? I had never been married before. Jason had never been married before. What could this mean? I looked up at the woman, searching her face for some clue, some reassurance, and found only measured calm, almost as if she were trained to deliver shocks without emotion. "It appears," she said slowly, "that a claim has been filed regarding a previous marriage that neither of you disclosed. Legally, this could affect the validity of your union." My heart sank, the floor beneath me seeming to shift in a subtle, terrifying way. I wanted to shout, to call Jason, to demand answers, but the moment passed like sand slipping through my fingers. The woman's next words dug deeper, chilling me to the bone. "We need to verify your side of the story, alone. That is why we asked you to come in without your husband." The implications hit me like ice water. Someone had found a loophole, a hidden detail from my past or my family's, and now it was threatening the life I had just begun. I tried to form questions, to make sense of the legal jargon and the annotations, but my mind was clouded with fear and disbelief. The woman continued, "This is unusual, but it's our duty. We have records that suggest conflicting information. Until we verify, your marriage cannot be legally confirmed. Any attempt to falsify information could have serious repercussions." My hands shook as I reached for my notebook, my instinct to write down every detail, every word, every nuance, as if capturing it could give me control over the chaos, but I knew control had already slipped through my fingers. Questions rose unbidden. Who filed this claim? Why now, after the wedding? Was it a family member, someone from my past, someone with a grudge or a secret they wanted to exploit? Every possibility seemed worse than the last. I realized then that the registry office wasn't just a bureaucratic obstacle, it was a window into a hidden part of my life, a part that had been carefully buried, or so I had thought, and now the shadows of my family's past, of choices I had never known about, were reaching forward to pull me into an entirely different reality. The woman handed me a pen and a form, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me shiver. "Answer truthfully. Every question matters. Omissions or inaccuracies will delay verification and could have serious repercussions," she said. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and began reading. The first questions were simple, almost benign, asking for basic information, addresses, names of family members, but then the questions began to dig deeper, probing connections, past relationships, documents I didn't remember signing, incidents I had only heard about in whispers as a child. Each line on the paper felt like a trap, a measure of how carefully I had navigated my life and how much I had trusted my own family's words. I wrote as honestly as I could, each word weighed with the understanding that this form might determine the fate of my marriage, the foundation of the life Jason and I had just begun building, and even as I wrote, a knot of fear grew in my chest, because somewhere in these questions was the piece of the puzzle that could unravel everything. Time blurred. The woman remained silent, observing me, her expression unreadable, as if she knew what was coming next but refused to warn me. The more I filled in, the more my heart raced, and I realized that the registry office, far from being a neutral observer, was now a vessel for the truths my family had hidden, truths I had been shielded from, truths that were no longer mine to ignore. When I finally set the pen down, my hand trembling, the woman leaned forward slightly, her voice softer this time, almost a whisper, yet carrying the weight of inevitability. "You need to contact certain relatives. Some explanations must come from them. Until that happens, we cannot proceed." She paused, letting her words hang in the air like a storm threatening to break. "And remember," she added, "this is why you were asked to come alone." I left the office numb, clutching the folder like a lifeline, my mind a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and questions, and as I drove back toward our apartment, the streets I had known all my life felt foreign and hostile, every familiar landmark a reminder that the life I thought I had built was already shifting beneath me, and the secrets I had been shielded from were about to surface in ways I could never have imagined. Back at the apartment, I couldn't bring myself to face Jason. He was still humming the same careless tune from this morning, oblivious to the storm that had just been dropped into my life, and I felt the weight of the secret pressing down like a physical force, heavy and unrelenting. I set the folder on the kitchen counter, ran my fingers over its surface, and tried to make sense of what I had just experienced. But every time I thought I understood, my mind conjured another terrifying possibility, one darker than the last. I opened the folder again, reading every note, every annotation, every scribbled remark the registry had included, and the words seemed to twist on the page like a cipher meant to confuse and intimidate. Somewhere in the middle of the documents, there it was, a name I didn't recognize, but it was unmistakably connected to me through my parents, a connection I had never been told about, never questioned, never imagined could exist. My father's handwriting on one of the notes from years ago jumped out at me, a name and date with a scribbled "confidential" next to it, as if it were something I was never supposed to know. My hands shook as I pieced it together. Someone from my past, someone my parents had hidden from me, had claimed a prior marriage, and now, years later, the registry office had uncovered it. I tried to call my mother, my fingers trembling over the phone as I hesitated to dial, knowing she would lie, deny, or deflect, but I needed answers, needed something solid to hold onto before my life unraveled completely. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked as her voicemail picked up, her voice, always sweet, always measured, now sounding like a mockery in my ears. I couldn't leave it at that. I needed to confront the source, but I also needed to protect Jason, so I made a plan, one that felt desperate and reckless at the same time. I would go to my parents' house, alone, dig into the past, and find out who had filed this claim and why, without telling Jason a word. The drive to their neighborhood was quiet, the streets familiar yet somehow oppressive, lined with trees that cast long shadows over the pavement, reminding me of the dark secrets they had always hidden, the small lies that had kept me obedient, compliant, and unaware of my true family history. When I arrived, the house seemed empty, eerily so, but I rang the bell anyway, my heart hammering as if it were trying to escape my chest. My mother answered, as expected, her smile bright and practiced, hiding something I had always known but never confronted head-on. The truth was never hers to give, only to manipulate. She ushered me in with the same warmth she always used, the warmth that masked control and deceit, and I noticed my father lurking in the hallway, his eyes dark, calculating, a man who had built an empire of secrets that now threatened to crush me in its wake. I wasted no time on pleasantries. I told them I had come about the registry office call, watching their reactions carefully. My mother's smile faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker of fear or surprise that I caught like a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye, and my father's jaw tightened, the first sign of tension I had ever seen in him when it came to family matters. I asked directly about the prior marriage claim, about the name and date I had found in the folder, and they exchanged a glance that spoke volumes before my father finally leaned back in his chair, voice measured, almost too calm. "It's complicated," he said, "but it's your family's history, something your mother and I thought was best left in the past." My stomach sank as I realized the magnitude of what I was uncovering. For years, they had hidden a marriage I was allegedly connected to, one that could legally void the union I had just celebrated, and now the registry office had forced the secret into the light. I pressed for specifics, but the answers were vague, evasive, clouded with excuses about paperwork, misunderstandings, and claims that had supposedly been resolved, though the registry clearly disagreed. My mother's voice trembled slightly as she added, "We didn't want to tell you because we thought it would ruin your happiness." That was it, the justification, flimsy and self-serving, for a lifetime of lies and half-truths. Anger, disbelief, and a deep, aching betrayal washed over me, but beneath it all was a gnawing fear. I had no idea who might have filed this claim or why, and the possibility that someone else, someone with intent to manipulate or harm me, was watching, waiting, and now had leverage over my life made my chest tighten in panic. I left their house shaken, trembling, and unable to look at Jason as I drove back, the quiet streets now feeling like corridors of a prison built by my own family's deceptions. I realized as I finally parked and finally exhaled that my life had changed forever. The wedding, the honeymoon, Jason, the future we had envisioned,
all of it was suddenly fragile, contingent upon secrets I had never been allowed to know, decisions my parents had made decades ago, and a shadow of a past I had no control over. And as I finally opened the door to our apartment, ready to face Jason, ready to embrace him and hope that our love could survive anything, I paused, realizing that the registry office, my parents, and the hidden claim were not just obstacles, they were the beginning of a revelation that could shatter every bond I had ever trusted, every promise I had ever made, and every life I had ever imagined for myself and Jason.
That night, I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in the dark, my mind replaying every word my parents had said, every glance, every hesitation, every half-truth I had been handed like a fragile mask meant to shield me from reality. And I realized that I had been living a lie my entire life, believing in the version of family they had constructed, a version that now felt like a house of cards teetering on the edge of collapse. I kept turning over the folder on the counter, the letters, notes, and annotations seeming to multiply in my mind, each detail a new question, each name a puzzle piece I couldn't yet place. Who had filed the claim? Why had it surfaced now, just after my wedding? And most importantly, what did it mean for Jason, for the life we had just started? I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I pulled out my laptop and began searching public records, old marriage databases, and anything remotely connected to the name my parents had refused to explain. Hours passed in a blur of clicks, searches, and growing panic as I traced dates, addresses, and connections, only to find fragments of information that hinted at someone my parents had deliberately kept hidden, who had once been legally married in a different state, someone whose life intersected with mine in ways I had never imagined. The deeper I dug, the more the web of lies stretched before me, twisting in ways that made my stomach churn, and I realized with a cold, sinking certainty that my parents had shielded me from more than just old documents. They had shielded me from people, from truths, from legal realities that could erase everything I had just built. I remembered the urgency in the registry office's voice, the way they had emphasized alone, and it hit me that this was bigger than paperwork. This was a confrontation with a past I had never been allowed to face. I tried calling the office again, hoping for clarification, for some guidance, but the receptionist's polite tone offered no reassurance, only instructions: verify the claim, gather documentation, and bring it in. I felt like I was being dragged into a storm I had never signed up for, a labyrinth of secrets, and as the night deepened, I realized I needed allies, but not Jason. He couldn't know yet, not until I understood what I was truly up against. I thought about old family friends, distant relatives I had always been told to trust, and hesitated, knowing that any one of them could be connected to the claim, could be part of the secret I was now forced to confront. And then I remembered Aunt Clara, my father's sister, the one person who had always been unusually candid with me, sometimes brutally so, the one whose loyalty seemed unshakable even when the rest of the family wove their delicate lies. I drove to her house before dawn, the streets silent, the sky dark and heavy, my mind racing with possibilities. When she opened the door, I could see the surprise in her eyes, quickly masked by concern. I barely greeted her before blurting out everything: the registry office, the folder, the claim, my parents' evasions. She led me inside without a word, and once we were seated, she leaned in close, her voice low, urgent. "You've stumbled on something your parents never wanted you to see," she said, glancing around as if the walls themselves might be listening. "It's been buried for decades, and if it reaches the wrong ears, it could destroy more than your marriage. But I think you have a right to know." My heart hammered. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, worn envelope, yellowed with age, the kind that carries secrets in its very texture. Inside were letters, legal papers, and photographs, images of people I vaguely recognized, older versions of faces I had seen only in family photos, but with subtle differences that made my stomach churn.
She explained, carefully but urgently, that my parents had concealed a prior marriage arrangement, one that involved me indirectly, not as a participant but as a legal heir of sorts, a connection that had remained hidden to protect the family reputation, a secret that had now been triggered by the registry office's cross-checking of old records. I listened in shock, unable to reconcile the loving, smiling parents I had married into to the manipulators who had orchestrated decades of concealment, and the weight of the revelation pressed down like lead. Aunt Clara warned me to move carefully, to gather proof, to understand every document, every connection, before approaching anyone else, because the moment I involved Jason or confronted my parents fully, the consequences could spiral beyond control. I left her house as dawn broke, the sky pale and colorless, my mind spinning with names, dates, and the realization that my marriage, my honeymoon, and even my sense of identity were now entangled in a web my parents had spun long before I was even born. Driving home, I felt a strange mix of fear, determination, and grief, knowing that the next steps I took could either save my life and marriage or shatter everything completely. And as I parked outside our apartment, I stared at the door, hesitant, aware that Jason would never understand the scale of what I was facing unless I brought him in, but I also knew that revealing even a fraction of the truth too early could destroy him too, or worse, could alert the hidden forces that had lain in wait all these years, now ready to pounce. I sat in the car for a long time, clutching the envelope and the folder from the registry office, realizing that my life had become something I had never imagined, a labyrinth of secrets, lies, and hidden truths, and that navigating it would require courage, cunning, and a willingness to face my family in ways I had never dared.
I returned home with the envelope clutched tightly in my hands, each step toward the apartment feeling heavier than the last, the weight of my parents' decades-old deceit pressing down on me like an invisible hand, determined to crush everything I had just begun to build with Jason. And the thought of keeping this secret from him, even temporarily, filled me with both guilt and dread. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter beside the folder from the registry office, and for a long moment I simply stared at it, the papers inside whispering threats I couldn't yet understand, their quiet rustle like the murmur of an unseen audience watching my every move. Jason entered the room, humming the same tune that had been echoing through our apartment all day, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, and I forced a smile, my heart aching, knowing I couldn't share a single detail. Not yet. Not until I had some semblance of control over the chaos. I told him I needed a few hours alone, claiming errands and research, while in reality I was preparing myself to confront my parents, to force them to explain what I had uncovered, and to piece together the true scope of the hidden marriage claim that now threatened to invalidate our union before it had even begun. My mind raced with questions. Who had filed the claim? Why? And how much of my life had been manipulated by my family for reasons I had never suspected? I gathered the folders, copies of the documents, and the envelope Aunt Clara had given me, and as I drove to my parents' house once more, the streets seemed unfamiliar. The city quiet, almost menacing in its stillness, each street lamp a sentinel highlighting the gravity of the confrontation I was about to initiate. When I arrived, the house looked the same, too calm, too ordered, as if nothing in decades had been hidden behind those walls, but I knew better, and as soon as the door opened, the false warmth I had once trusted greeted me like a mask I could no longer tolerate. I demanded that they sit with me in the living room, away from distractions, and when they finally took their seats, I laid the folders and envelope before them, watching as their expressions shifted imperceptibly, a flicker of recognition, concern, and perhaps fear crossing their faces in a way that told me they knew just how much I had uncovered. I spoke slowly but firmly, recounting the registry office call, the demand that I come alone, the annotations and legal notes that indicated a prior marriage, and the fact that I had spoken to Aunt Clara, who had confirmed long-hidden truths that my parents had kept secret for years.
My mother's hands trembled slightly, her voice softening as she said, "It's complicated. We were protecting you." But there was no conviction in her words, only the hollow echo of someone who knew that the past could no longer be contained. My father's jaw tightened, and he leaned back, eyes narrowing, calculating his next words, but I pressed on, demanding to know who filed the claim, why it had surfaced now, and how they could justify keeping such a monumental secret from me on the very day I had committed my life to someone else. The room was tense, the kind of silence that pressed on your chest and made breathing feel heavy, and for a moment I wondered if I had pushed too far, if their secrecy would escalate into anger, denial, or worse, an attempt to manipulate me into compliance without revealing the full truth. Then my mother's face paled, and my father's carefully constructed mask faltered for a fraction of a second, enough for me to see that there was more to this than mere concealment. They had known, long before my wedding, that someone, somewhere had a claim that could threaten me, and they had chosen deception over honesty, control over love, manipulation over trust. I could feel a growing resolve, an understanding that whatever their intentions, I could no longer be passive, could no longer allow my life to be dictated by secrets and hidden documents. I had to take action, gather proof, and prepare for the possibility that this was only the beginning of a conflict that would reach far beyond our marriage and into the very heart of my family's legacy. As they began to speak, offering fragmented explanations, half-truths, and vague justifications, I realized that clarity would not come easily, that every answer would spawn more questions, and that the path forward would require courage, intelligence, and perhaps a confrontation I had been avoiding for too long. And yet, beneath the fear, beneath the anger and the shock, there was a determination forming, a seed of defiance that refused to allow my parents' manipulation to dictate the future Jason and I were trying to build. I left their house with my mind racing, every step a reminder that the secrets of the past were no longer safely hidden, that the registry office, Aunt Clara, and the mysterious claim had set a chain of events into motion that I could not stop, and that each day, each decision, each conversation could tip the balance between preserving our marriage or losing it before it truly began. When night fell over the city, I sat alone in our apartment, the weight of hidden histories pressing down on me, and I understood that the real battle was only beginning, and nothing, not love, not loyalty, not family, would ever be the same again.
The following morning, I woke with a sense of urgency, the folder and envelope from the registry office sitting heavily on the kitchen table, a tangible reminder that my life had become entangled in something far larger and darker than I had ever imagined. And I knew that if I didn't take action now, the consequences could be catastrophic for both my marriage and my sense of self. I made myself a cup of coffee, though I barely tasted it, my mind racing through every detail I had gathered, every name, every date, every clue hidden in the documents and the photographs Aunt Clara had given me, and I realized that the most critical piece of the puzzle was still missing, the identity and intentions of the person who had filed the prior marriage claim. I couldn't rely on my parents. They had already shown themselves willing to conceal, manipulate, and lie to protect themselves, and their evasiveness had only heightened my suspicion that there was more at play, a hidden hand orchestrating events I had no knowledge of. I decided to begin my own investigation, cautiously, methodically, knowing that one misstep could alert whoever was watching and give them leverage over me and Jason. I started with public records, combing through marriage registrations, property records, and even old court documents, piecing together connections that weren't obvious at first glance. And with every document I found, the web of intrigue grew more tangled, more sinister, and more impossible to ignore.
I discovered a name recurring in multiple states, tied to legal filings, to addresses my parents had once mentioned in passing but never elaborated upon, and to a marriage certificate that had been amended and sealed years ago, a certificate that now appeared to intersect with my own legal identity in a way that made my stomach churn. As I dug deeper, I found traces of correspondence, letters sent to old family addresses, some intercepted by my parents, others stored away, all pointing to someone who had carefully constructed a plan over decades, quietly waiting for the right moment to activate it. And I began to understand the terrifying precision of the timing. The registry office had uncovered a loophole or discrepancy that now placed me squarely in the middle of a game I had never consented to play. My thoughts raced to Jason, to the life we had just begun, to the honeymoon we had packed for, and the crushing weight of the secret pressed down harder, making me wonder how long I could maintain the facade, how long I could protect him from a truth that could unravel everything we had fought to create. I realized I needed to speak to Aunt Clara again. She had been my only ally so far, the only person who had given me fragments of context without judgment, and I needed her perspective on this mysterious claimant, the one person who had the knowledge to connect all the threads into a coherent picture. When I arrived at her house, I could see the concern etched into her face before she even said a word, the quiet tension between us a reflection of the storm that had already begun, and I immediately laid out everything I had found, the recurring names, the hidden addresses, the sealed certificates, the timing, and the implications for both my identity and my marriage. Aunt Clara listened in silence, occasionally nodding, her eyes narrowing as she processed the scope of what I had uncovered, and when I finished, she leaned back, her voice low and urgent, warning me that the claimant was not only connected legally, but had motives that could be deeply personal, even malicious, and that confronting them without preparation could have severe consequences. She suggested strategies, ways to gather proof without alerting the claimant, and cautioned me to be careful with every step I took, because one slip could trigger actions that I was not prepared for, actions that could reach into my life, my home, and even the registry office itself. As I left Aunt Clara's house, a sense of both dread and determination settled over me, and I realized that my life had been pulled into a labyrinth of deceit, legal maneuvering, and family manipulation, where every ally was suspect, every document a potential weapon, and every action carried risk. That evening, I began contacting lawyers, attempting to verify the authenticity of the marriage claim, the connections to my family, and the legal implications, all while keeping Jason in the dark, because revealing the truth too soon could shatter his trust and leave him vulnerable to the fallout. Hours blurred into night as I cross-referenced records, called distant offices, and pieced together the claimant's identity, someone with knowledge of my family's past, someone who had waited for the right moment, someone whose motives were shrouded in mystery, but whose actions now had the power to rewrite my life. I realized that the claimant's timing was not coincidental. They had orchestrated this revelation to coincide with the most significant moment in my personal life, exploiting both legal and emotional leverage. And as the reality sunk in, I felt a chill sweep through me, the first real taste of fear in days. My apartment, once a place of comfort and joy, now felt like a cage, the walls closing in, the folders and envelopes on the counter like silent sentinels watching my every move, reminding me that the web of secrets, lies, and claims I had stumbled into was far from resolved, and that the true confrontation, the real reckoning, was still ahead, waiting for me to find the courage to face it. And in the quiet hours of the night, as I stared at the documents spread before me, I understood with clarity that this was no longer about curiosity or even discovery. It was a battle for my identity, my marriage, and my future, and the path forward would demand cunning, resilience, and an unflinching willingness to confront the shadows my family had spent a lifetime casting.
The next morning, armed with every piece of information I had painstakingly gathered, I set out to locate the mysterious claimant, the person whose presence loomed over my life like a shadow I couldn't escape. And as I drove through unfamiliar streets, clutching the folders, the envelope, and my laptop filled with records, I realized that this confrontation could change everything, not just my marriage, but the foundation of my family, the identity I had always believed was mine, and the fragile sense of trust I had in the people closest to me. I parked outside a modest, nondescript building that matched the address I had traced through countless records, my heart hammering as though it were trying to escape my chest, and I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I had prepared, that I had evidence, and that I was not going in blindly, even though fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve. I walked up to the door, each step echoing in the silent hallway, and when I knocked, a man in his late 40s answered, his eyes sharp and calculating, the kind of gaze that measured every detail, every expression, as if it could read secrets buried deep in my bones. He looked at me for a long moment, saying nothing, and I realized with a jolt that the calm exterior masked a lifetime of cunning and calculation, and that whatever conversation was about to happen would not be ordinary or forgiving. I introduced myself cautiously, keeping my tone even, and explained that I had questions regarding the prior marriage claim, that the registry office had contacted me, and that I needed clarity to resolve the situation legally and responsibly. His expression didn't change, he simply gestured for me to sit, and the office, small and cluttered with papers and files, seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in as I tried to steady my breathing. He finally spoke, his voice calm but layered with something I couldn't quite identify, amusement, disdain, or perhaps satisfaction, and said, "I've been expecting someone like you. You're a fast learner, I'll give you that." My stomach dropped. Expecting me? How long had he been watching, waiting, manipulating, and planning? And why now, on the very day after my wedding? He leaned back, steepling his fingers, and explained that the claim was legitimate, but not in the way I had feared. It wasn't about invalidating my marriage for personal gain, but about asserting a legal connection to my family's assets, to past property agreements, and to a branch of my lineage my parents had deliberately concealed. He said that my parents had hidden documents, altered histories, and carefully constructed a narrative to exclude this information from me, and now, decades later, the law demanded recognition of the connections I had been kept ignorant of. As he spoke, a part of me seethed with anger. My parents had chosen deception over honesty, manipulation over truth, and now I was left to reconcile the life I had believed in with the reality I was uncovering. Yet beneath the anger, another emotion stirred: fear. The claimant wasn't cruel or malicious in intent, at least not yet, but his meticulous preparation, his control of information, and his ability to use the law as leverage demonstrated a dangerous level of power, and I realized that any misstep on my part could be catastrophic for both me and Jason. I asked questions about the process, about what I needed to do to ensure my marriage's legality while protecting myself, and he provided instructions, precise and detailed, yet devoid of warmth or reassurance. Each word felt like a test, a challenge, a measure of whether I could navigate the web of deceit, secrecy, and legal complexity my parents had constructed. I left the office with a mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that while I had gained clarity on the claimant's identity and motives, I was now firmly in the center of a storm that would demand every ounce of strategy, courage, and careful planning I could muster. Driving home, I rehearsed how I would approach my parents next, what evidence I would confront them with, and how I could protect Jason without revealing the full extent of the chaos we were now entangled in. But each thought was shadowed by the chilling realization that I was only beginning to understand the magnitude of their deception. That evening, I returned home to find Jason blissfully unaware, laughing at some trivial TV show, the apartment filled with the comfort of normalcy I could no longer feel, and I watched him, the warmth and safety he represented, and I felt the sharp pang of guilt and fear intertwine. Guilt for keeping him in the dark, fear that the revelations would shatter everything we had just started. I set the documents on the counter, my hands trembling as I organized them for the confrontation with my parents, knowing that the next step would define the course of my life, my marriage, and the hidden truths that had silently guided my existence until now.
And as I sat alone, staring at the papers that held the key to a decades-old deception, I understood with stark clarity that this was no longer just about legality or family politics. It was about reclaiming my life from the shadows, confronting lies that had been nurtured for generations, and preparing for the inevitable clash that would determine whether the truth would finally set me free or destroy everything I had ever loved.
The following day, I gathered all the folders, documents, and evidence I had collected, the registry office papers, Aunt Clara's envelope, and every record from my investigation, and drove to my parents' house with a determination I had never felt before, knowing that this confrontation would either bring long overdue truth or fracture my family beyond repair. And as I stepped through the door, I felt the weight of every secret, every lie, and every hidden agenda pressing down on me like a storm ready to break. My parents were seated in the living room, their expressions carefully neutral, but I could sense the tension, the slight twitch of my father's hand, the tightness around my mother's lips, as if they too knew the reckoning had arrived. I laid the folders on the coffee table in front of them and said clearly, without hesitation, "I know everything. The registry office called, I've spoken to Aunt Clara, and I've tracked down the claimant. The lies end today." My father's eyes flickered, my mother's breath hitched, and for a moment the silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the faint hum of the heater. I began systematically presenting the evidence, the prior marriage claim, the concealed documents, the sealed certificates, and the patterns of manipulation they had orchestrated for decades, each revelation a nail driven into the foundation of their carefully constructed facade. I watched them squirm under the weight of their own deceit, realizing finally that their power over me had always been an illusion, and that I had grown strong enough, informed enough, and courageous enough to face the consequences of the truths they had tried to bury. My mother tried to interrupt, to explain, to justify, but I cut her off calmly yet firmly, insisting that excuses were no longer acceptable, that the timelines, the documents, and the legal ramifications left no room for evasion. And as I spoke, I felt a clarity and resolve I had never known before. The power to reclaim my life, to protect my marriage, and to demand accountability. My father finally leaned back, his mask of authority faltering, and admitted, reluctantly, that they had hidden the prior claim to protect the family reputation, to shield me from embarrassment, and to maintain control over what they perceived as my destiny. But the evidence now proved that control was no longer theirs to wield. I explained that the registry office and the claimant had provided precise instructions, and that any further concealment would not only endanger the legality of my marriage, but also expose them to legal consequences they had so carefully avoided. The room felt heavy, charged with tension as the gravity of their decades-long deception settled over us all, and I realized that I had shifted from being a passive participant in my family's narrative to the one holding the power to define truth and consequence. They finally admitted, piece by piece, the hidden connections, the altered histories, the manipulations, and I listened, taking in every word, every admission, knowing that while the truth had been delayed for decades, it was now fully visible, undeniable, and irrevocable. When the last explanation had been given, I felt a sense of release, as if a door that had been locked for years had finally swung open, the light of reality flooding in and leaving no shadow unexamined. I drove home afterward, the folders secure in my bag, my mind exhausted but clear, and when I entered our apartment, Jason was waiting, still blissfully unaware of the storm I had navigated, and I realized it was finally safe to bring him into the truth, to share the facts and the context in a way that would preserve our bond and protect our marriage.
I explained everything to him calmly, carefully, showing him the evidence, the registry office correspondence, and Aunt Clara's documentation, and though he was shocked, frightened, and incredulous, he held my hand and promised we would face it together, a united front against whatever challenges remained. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense of control, and a belief that while my family's secrets had threatened to define my life, they no longer would. The truth had been uncovered, the lies confronted, and Jason and I could finally move forward with our marriage intact, stronger for having faced deception, manipulation, and hidden truths together. And as I looked at him, smiling despite the chaos, I realized that the registry office call, the hidden claimant, and the years of concealed family secrets had all led me here, to clarity, to courage, and to a future defined not by the shadows of the past, but by the choices I would make from this moment forward.